Hello, and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book that was important to James Ellroy, a book that moved him, thrilled him, inspired him. I have a great show for you today because this week I'm going to be talking about a book I actually gave to James Ellroy, which I know was kind of important to him. But before I do that, I want you to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and you'll have all this content flowing straight to your inbox. Have you hit it? Have you? Okay, good. Okay, so in 2008, I was doing my PhD on James Ellroy, and I was fortunate enough to be speaking to him regularly on the phone. He was very generous and kind with his time, and we were having great conversations. Then, in the Daily Telegraph one day, I stumbled across an obituary of a writer called Theodora Keogh. And I was intrigued by this because it turns out she'd written the very first Black Dahlia novel, a novel called The Other Girl. And it was a very good obituary. She had a remarkable life, and I just mentioned it to Ellroy. I said because I knew he'd read everything he ever could find on the Black Dahlia. He'd read Jack Webb's The Badge, where he discovered the case. He'd also read John Gregory Dunn's best-selling novel True Confessions about the case, and then when he was researching the novel for his own Black Dahlia novel, his breakout novel, he'd gone into library loans, every newspaper, all the newspaper coverage, particularly the four Los Angeles newspapers there were at the time that were covering the case day by day. So I asked him as he read The Other Girl, he's like, no, I'd never heard of that. He's never heard of Theodora Keogh. And it turns out that this Daily Telegraph obituary was the only obituary written in any major newspaper about her. She was a forgotten writer, but she was part of high society in her day, and the obituary was actually written by Hugo Vickers, who was a royal biographer. So that gives you some indication of some hint as to who she was. So let me go a little bit more into Theodora Keogh. Okay, Theodora Keogh was the granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States. And her father, Archibald Roosevelt, was a war hero who fought and was wounded in World War One and World War Two, highly decorated, and after the war became an investment banker. Keogh was brought up in Oyster Bay, Cold Harbor, Long Island, and lived in, obviously, brought up in a wealthy, very wealthy family, but had a taste for adventure. Joined a ballet company, didn't like that, moved to Rio where she became a dancer. And that's where she met a fellow dancer and costume designer, Tom Keogh. They married, she took his name, and Tom Keogh actually had a career in Hollywood as a costumer, worked with Willa Kim and many famous costumers. They had a tempestuous marriage, but he worked on famous films like Daddy Longlegs and The Pirates, and that probably gave Theodora her taste of Hollywood, which is essential to any Black Dahlia story. Hollywood is essential to it. I know, she was part of Hollywood in the kind of post-war years. That may have been where she heard of the murder of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. Her marriage to Tom Keogh eventually broke up, although she retained his name as her author surname. They both had affairs. She found out he was having an affair. She had an affair in revenge with their chauffeur. And she published 9 novels. And in one of those novels, they deal with themes like revenge and sexuality. And of course, this is an era in the 1940s and 50s and even early 1960s where homosexual acts were still illegal and would be still very taboo even when when it was legalized late 60s in the UK and slightly later than that in the US. And her novels, such as Meg, she dealt with revenge because she had a character based on her husband who could only be sexually aroused in his marriage when he thought about a swarthy young Indian boy. And she also dealt a lot with lesbian issues. Now, she was married 3 times, and in her obituary and in all the information I couldn't find details about her having a relationship with another woman, but she wrote extensively about lesbian issues, and she was part of the lesbian pulp fiction boom of the 1950s. Highly acclaimed novels, now even more acclaimed because they've been rediscovered with, the kind of LGBT rights and liberation. And her novels were acclaimed by such figures as Patricia Highsmith, and random figures like John Gielgud. The Other Girl, which was her 9th and final novel. Now, apologies, this is a very, very boring cover. If you want to see a real cover, here. This is better. Just get it out of the light. The Other Girl. This is a kind of much more kind of seamy, sordid sort of cover. And I actually had 2 copies of this book. So the one with the nice cover I gave to Ellroy, and I kept this one for my own records. So The Other Girl is basically the Black Dahlia. And it's a fictionalized account, naturally. So it is late 40s Los Angeles, just after the war. And our main character is Marge, who is comes from a farm and is working as a mechanic, and again is kind of like a common figure in both Keogh's fiction and also lesbian pulp fiction of the time. She is a strong lesbian character, but also, having relations with men as was expected. And she meets Betty, and that's the only name we're ever given. We're never given a full name, Elizabeth Short. It's Betty, but we know it's Elizabeth Short. And they strike up a friendship over the course of a day or two. And they're surrounded by strange characters, because this is Los Angeles, where everybody's involved with celebrity or the movies, or whoever it's the detritus, or, just everybody's somehow involved in this world. So we have Herman Lee, a film producer, who has designs on Betty. And we also have this strange woman called the Duchess, of ambiguous European descent. But these characters are kind of older, that they're thinking back to they're past their prime, they're thinking back to their glory days. But they're in LA and they're trading off the name, which is, a very common theme in Ellroy's fiction and in any portrayal of Los Angeles, really. And Betty and Marge have this friendship, and it's kind of like a rival friendship. They're both opposites. It's kind of a case of opposites attract. And, Marge is the lesbian woman, but with a side of herself that can be attracted to men, or at least can show that. Betty is a straight woman, but with the side of herself that has this relationship, this kind of experimenting with Marge. And they go out on a double date with some French sailors. And Betty's very enamored with her sailor character called Roger. And Marge is more along for the ride. But they actually have an orgy together. Again, this is strong stuff for... Oh, sorry, it's upside down. This is strong stuff for... This was published in 1962. But more on that a bit later, because the publication history is kind of very interesting. This is strong stuff for the time. The sort of material that couldn't be put on film until later, but in pulp fiction, particularly the lesbian genre, it could be shown. So they have an orgy, and again, the sexual dynamic is interesting because, in a way, we get the sense that the two women are more interested in each other, perhaps. Although Betty's very interested in Roger, but Marge is not interested in her male date. And we get the sense of who's playing who here. Now, actually, because it's from Marge's perspective, the novel, we get the sense, because she feels slighted and wronged, that Betty's playing her. The straight woman is playing with her feelings, not the other way round. And it culminates, I don't really need to tell you, do I? Because it's the Black Dahlia story. we know roughly where this is going. But it's very interesting to read it from a different perspective, because I think with True Confessions and the Black Dahlia, and then post James Ellroy's take on it, you had many more true crime books came out about it. Steve Hodel, Larry Harnish's Theory, there's Hugh Eatwell, Black Dahlia, Red Roses, many books about the case. And all of them are about investigating every single angle about the case, investigating every clue, pulling up a suspect, and trying to match the suspect with the evidence. So essentially solving the case. But Keogh's take on the case is, you can tell her memory of it, because her novel is written 15 years after the case. Her memory of it is from the tabloid coverage, probably from gossip, from what she heard in LA at the time. And possibly she read Jack Webb's The Badge, because Betty is not sympathetic, really, in her world. I mean, obviously, no one should be murdered, no one should lose their life, and especially they shouldn't lose their life in such a grotesque manner. It's very interesting in how that's handled. But there is the sense that her Betty is a shallow woman, that rather than Marge is a woman of depth who meets this very shallow person, and therefore they're mismatched, and therefore there's almost that's a kind of betrayal in itself, because Betty can never give her the friendship that really, or the companionship or the relationship that Marge demands. So in that sense, it's a little bit negative and a little bit dated in that sense. If we want a more fully rounded Betty Short, I mean, the sort of character that Ellroy gave to Betty Short, even though we didn't see her in the present tense in his novel, Black Dahlia, but he really empathized with her because he was a misfit. He was a guy bombing around LA, sleeping wherever he could, sleeping with whoever he could, broke, not really knowing what he wanted to do in life. And, if fortunes had swapped the other way, maybe Ellroy would be killed and Betty Short would have made it as some sort of creative artist. There's stories that she wanted to be an actress or a model or something like that. So, but in many ways, this is still a very progressive novel, because one of the things about lesbian pulp fiction that was new, is that homosexual relationships had been portrayed before, and lesbian ones, and in particular the lesbian ones, before Pulp Fiction, the lesbian always had to be punished for her relationship or for her sexuality. And lesbian pulp changed that. And the ending to this is very clever. I mean, there's punishment, because it's a Black Dahlia story, and if anything is punishing, it's the violence meted out in the Black Dahlia murder, but it's not what you expected. Okay, so Keogh lived a really fascinating life. Unfortunately, the Black Dahlia was published in the UK first in 1962 and didn't get an American publication till about 1966 or 1967. So 5 years it took for it to get published in the US, because the material was, so controversial. And if anything, the lesbian pulp boom, it was kind of receding. But obviously the violence in the story was controversial. She wrote one more novel called The Love Life of Sometime Malone, which is now believed to be lost. It was never published. We're not sure, but we believe Keogh had a falling out with her agent and her editor, her publisher, and she turned her back on writing. And she lived in Paris for a while. She lived in Rome for a while. She was married to a tugboat captain. She sailed the Atlantic, and finally she settled in North Carolina, where she lived to a ripe old age. And shortly before she died, between 2002 and 2007, Olympia Press reissued all of her novels. And there was a revival of interest in her work. as with the new LGBT fiction out there, and with the revival of interest in lesbian pulp fiction. Okay, a couple of stories about Ellroy and I, and the other girl. So I'd been talking to Ellroy on the phone, and I was due to make a trip to the United States for two reasons. One, I was going to visit his archive at the University of South Carolina and do some archival research there. Then I was going to go straight to Los Angeles and meet Ellroy in person. And I was very excited about this. This is big stuff for a PhD candidate. And I got the idea, I want to give him a copy of Theodora Keogh's The Other Girl. He's read everything on the Black Dahlia, but he hasn't read this. I want to, I want to plug that gap in his knowledge of the case. And so I ordered a copy of the book, and it arrived like the day before I left. So I didn't get a chance to read it. Flew into Detroit, where I was visiting my in-laws. Then my wife and I drove down from Detroit to South Carolina, which is quite a journey. And my wife was doing the driving, and we decided, because I wanted to read the book before I gave it to Ellroy, just in case he did small talk, I would read the book aloud as we were driving, through the Midwest down into the Deep South. And let me tell you, some of the stuff in it is kind of racy, very racy. And to be reading this aloud when you're on the freeway, it was kind of hair raising. I remember saying to my wife, they don't do breathalyzer tests for lesbian pulp fiction, do they? Because it was an intense story, intense sexually and also intense emotionally and in relation to finally violence. Anyway, so I read the book. We spent some wonderful time at the University of South Carolina, Ellroy's archive. And then when we went to LA, we met Ellroy at his then home in the Ravenswood. And by the way, the number of Ellroy's apartment I later found out he used again, because the Ravenswood makes an appearance. A rather very sordid incident occurs in Blood's a Rover, which Ellroy was finishing up at the time. He gave me a galley copy. And this sordid incident happens in the same room that Ellroy had. It's the same room number, which was an interesting... it was just one of those interesting things. And the apartment, it was red walls, monochrome, blood red, black furniture. The only books on the walls were Ellroy's books. The photos on the walls were old LA crime scenes, including the Dahlia, but old LA, shots of the streets. When there seemed in black and white, makes it much more beautiful. The shop fronts were much more beautiful than the kind of consumerist 21st century shop fronts. And Ellroy had another few things that popped up in Blood's a Rover. He told me not to tell anyone, but they popped up in Blood's a Rover anyway. One is he had toy pet crocodiles on his bed, fluffy pet crocodile toys. He says something about crocodiles I really like, because he has this big kind of alligator grin. And he had toys of like the Sopwith Camel and the Red Baron, World War I fighter planes, just dangling from the ceiling. And it was just an incredible time. So I gave him the book. And he was just like, oh great. He's just like, so tell me a bit about it. And I was just like, well, it was part of the lesbian pulp boom. He's like, lesbian porn? No, lesbian pulp. We laughed about that, and we had that was a great conversation, and it ended up being published in my first book, Conversation to James Ellroy. Ellroy leaned back on this big fainting couch he had, and I sat over him. He lay back, and I sat over him, and I was kind of like the shrink. I was Freud, and he was the patient, and we did this wonderful interview. And as I'm leaving, he's kind of like, enjoy LA. He'd given me a gift, and he's like, have a good time in LA. And he's like, and I'll have a good time with this, sir. And you imagine the cover with the naked woman on the front. I was just like, oh, great. But we never spoke about it again. I think it's partly because that was my last real conversation with him until I saw him a few times after that in Manchester. But I didn't really get to really spend a huge amount of time with him again until I wrote his biography, Love Me, Fears and Danger. And for some reason, it just never came up. But I never really found out what he thought of it. I mean, I know he must have read it. It's 130 pages or so, and it is gripping from start to finish. You can read it in an evening. So I don't know what he thought about it, but I'm glad I managed to plug the gap plug the little gap in his Black Dahlia knowledge and talk about this novel, which was the very first Black Dahlia novel. And from my synopsis, you could probably guess where it's going. But there's also this great coincidence that Ellroy and Keogh had this idea that a woman could be involved in the murder, which hasn't really popped up in any of the true crime books. So it's interesting that they both had this brainwave. Okay, thanks very much. Next week I'm in Krakow for a short holiday, so I will see you the week after then for another book in Ellroy Reads. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to hit subscribe, hit like, and many more episodes will be coming your way. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.